December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
I don't really remember a whole lot, to tell you the truth. It was I do remember coming home from church and hearing about that bombing. And
so what was the sense on the home front when you got two of your brothers out, one in the Pacific, one in the in Europe?
During those war years, we had we did things at home, on the home front, that a lot of the newer kids probably wouldn't realize. I remember in wood shop up in Mr. Jakery's wood shop up in Washington Junior High School, they handed out kits of balsa wood and with templates, and you were to carve the fuselage, the wings, stabilizer, the whole thing of airplanes, model airplanes, according to these templates. And Mr. Jakewees, the teacher, would check them out to make sure that they were accurate. And then they were put together and they were painted black. And the reason for it was that the pilots, in getting their pilot training, would be able to, they would hang these in the air and they would be able to recognize whether they were foreign or domestic airplanes. And Don, my brother Don, remembers that when he was going through pilot training, that they would have those and they were to try to recognize them. So that was one of the things we did for the war effort.
How big were these airplanes?
Oh, they were just small models like this. We collected milkweed seeds that were used in, I think it was the life preservers. I think life preservers they collected. We used to bring all our fat from home, the grease put in cans that was used for for munitions projects. So we used to carry all of our magazines and the papers to school, and that was for the scrap drives. Yeah, the home front really did do a lot in those days, and of course there was all the rationing and that we had to contend with meat, sugar, tires.
During World War II, there was a battle on the home front, too. The tussle with ration books, tokens, and stamps. Supplies were short, and everything from shoes to gasoline was doled out. No stamps, no soap. Every cut of meat carried a certain point value, and many times stamps were more valuable than money. And rationing proved that the American people had vivid imaginations. The Office of Price Administration was swamped with fantastic tales from people who claimed they faced disaster without an extra allotment of this or that.
I delivered meat down at, I worked for Lofgren's Meat Market down in the end of the Dahlstrom building down there. The buildings are all gone, but I worked there and we delivered meat. I knew the part of the rationing system with tokens and stamps and all that stuff. So it was not always easy with.
Did you ever find people trying to beat the system with the tokens and the rations?
Well, you had a business to run. In those days, I don't know what the arrangements were with the farmers, but you were not supposed to take meat off the farms. But if you couldn't get meat, I know there were some incidences where I guess you would consider it black market meat. It would come in the back door at night or something like that. Well, I don't.
Deer or something like that?
No, cows.
Oh, they'd be cows.
So I don't know what the arrangements were with the farmers and the government, but sometimes it would happen, or maybe a pig would show up. There always seemed to be an excess of tokens, and I can remember a bunch of us in the evenings would go up to Washington Junior High School and use the gymnasium. And then we usually had to have an adult, with to supervise. But I'd go up, I'd stand on that steps up there and I'd throw out tokens, these meat tokens and things, and the kids were scrambling them. It was just like you see where kids scramble for pennies. I guess I was king on the mountain or something, but I had all these tokens in my pockets, and I would toss them out, and the kids would scramble, of course, take them home. But there always seemed to be excess tokens, and that had to be accounted for in the meat market. And I think some of that was due to some of that meat that came in the back door, and you're just trying to satisfy your customers. These people were good people, but you know, sometimes you broke the rules, I guess, just to survive. But Art and I joined us. We enlisted in the Air Force together. Art he was 2 months older than I. He had received his draft notice, and if you had received it,
this would have been what time period?
This is 1950.
50, okay.
Yeah. So if you received your draft notice, you were not supposed to go looking at any other service. You were just supposed to answer your draft call. But this is when they were really starting out in the Korean War, and they were needing ground troops. And I can remember that I was working on a house next door, and we were Dad was building a new house, and I was putting shingles on the corner there, and Art came and, "You're going to get your draft notice pretty soon. What would you think if we went and enlisted and took the long way around, going into the Air Force or the Navy instead of being in the Army?" So it happened so quick. We went down, I took my apron off, we went down and talked to the Air Force and recruiter, and my goodness, it wasn't more than about a week we were on our way to Buffalo to get enlisted and sworn in. Down to Lackland Air Force Base, and we were our serial numbers were consecutive, by the way, and we ended up in the same barracks down in Lackland. Our basic training was only 3 weeks and 4 days. It was so fast. There were so many guys coming into Lackland. It was a tent city, and they couldn't handle it. I never even got my full complement of clothing. They just ran out of stuff, and I had to pick that up at my next base. Never went on a hike, never went on a bivouac or anything. We had our gas masks on, strapped on our belts. We were going to go down and take gas training, and we were just ready to go. And the drill sergeant said, "Don't have time, put them away." So I never went through that part of it. I did learn how to field strip a rifle. I fired 50 shots to get some kind of a qualifications, and that was basically all I ever fired a gun in 4 years of military life. Never went on hike or anything. Never slept in a pup tent. I had a cakewalk of an experience, so it was. I can't complain. When I went through, they were trying to figure out what to do with you, and so my aptitude test showed that I was best at working with my hands, and I had learned that in school. So when they asked me what I wanted to do, I told them that I had been working in construction with my dad, and that in carpentry, and the guy says, "Well, you didn't join a construction outfit, you joined the Air Force." So he said, "Pick out 3 things." So I always liked to monkey with my car and with wrenches and things, so I chose auto mechanics first. Then I chose airplane mechanic. He says, "You got to have one more." Well, I just thought of radio mechanic. They kind of go together. Well, that's the one I got. So,
Number 3.
yeah. So they sent me up to Scott Air Force Base up by St. Louis to study for over a year's training in how to be a ground radio mechanic. In those days, it was vacuum tubes.
Basic in every radio installation is the vacuum tube. Produced in a wide variety of sizes and types, the vacuum tube is the fundamental element in modern radio communication.
When we were finishing up our course, the instructor said that, that there was a new invention that he just learned about that took the place of a vacuum tube, and it was called a transistor. Now he says, I don't know what it's like or how big it is or anything, but it doesn't produce heat and it takes less power. And of course, this was where the vacuum tubes were bad, because they produced so much heat that the insulation would deteriorate. You'd get shorts, and of course all the vacuum tubes and stuff. But then the transistor had come onto the scene, and by the time our VHF, very high frequency, UHF, ultra high frequency, by the time that equipment got into the field, it was obsolete, because it was coming so fast, the electronics. This was airways and air communication systems, and they would send out teams to go to different places like Goose Bay, Labrador, all these little stations up in the Baffin Islands for weather stations, and to put up equipment. We had diesel mechanics, pole climbers, cable splicers, radio mechanics, all of those that would go together to put up a station. I ended up with 3 different trips to Sondrestrom Air Base up in Greenland. And at that time they were building the Thule Air Base up on top of Greenland, because that was the fear that the Russians were going to come over the Arctic and attack the United States. So there were 3 bases up there. There was one at the bottom of Greenland, that was a place called Narsarsuaq. Also had another label from World War II, which was BW1, which stood for Bluey West 1. And I was at another place halfway up in Greenland. It was called Bluey West 8, or Sondrestrom Air Base, Sondrestrom Fjord. And we were about 90 miles away from the coastline, about 50 miles north of the Arctic Circle. And we were there, this base had been there in World War II, and it was reactivated, so we had all the old Quonset huts, and they reactivated everything. And our job was to put in new antennas, and so I learned how to dig in permafrost. I was up there at all parts of the season, and cold and summertime, and the gnats were terrible. We had to wear mosquito nets, because otherwise these little bugs would crawl in your eyes and in your ears and up your nose, and so it was a different experience. So we used to dig these holes by pick and shovel in permafrost. Quite often in the evenings they would have card games, and that was all new to me, because I never played that stuff. And I remember getting
a good mission guy. I just want you to know that, yeah.
And they were playing blackjack, And they talked me into doing that, and I still don't know what I'm doing. I wouldn't know anything about it today. But I did start in a little bit, and I won. I had beginner's luck, and that was pretty nice. And I don't think there was much money involved. I would never have played away a paycheck or anything. But I didn't mind winning, and then I lost. And I didn't like it. I had nothing to show for it, and that cured me. And I walked away. I put that away from my life. I was not a good gambler, and I learned my lesson there. This had to be out Scott Air Force Base, and I had a fellow that double bunked with. We double bunked, and he liked to smoke cigars. Well, I had been cured of the smoking bit, and gave that up. But we were sitting in the back on the floor of the day room there, and the officer was lecturing us, and we had to go back and clean up our bunk areas and the whole business, and there was going to be an inspection. Well, Laverne gave me a cigar, and we were sitting on the back there with our backs against the wall. And I was puffing on that thing, trying to see how much smoke I could make and to see how long of an ash I could have on the end of that cigar. And I wasn't inhaling, but there was enough stuff getting into me. And when we finished and we were supposed to go over there to the barracks, I guess I was just as white as a piece of paper. And I barely could make it over there, and I flopped into my bed instead of cleaning up, and didn't that officer come through on that first barracks, and I was lying in my bed, and I had to get up and start cleaning. Well, I was in no shape to do that, but anyway, so that was kind of a new experience. I was assigned back up to Frankfurt at the Rhein-Main Air Base, which is at Frankfurt, Germany, and we had just the base had just gone through the Berlin airlift. You remember what that was about. Last night I was looking out over my slides and things, and if you remember, maybe you don't remember, but there were pilots. There was a Czech airplane, a Czech pilot that was on training mission, and he flew over and landed at Rhein-Main, and I worked in the control tower maintenance. So I took this picture of this Czech airplane that had landed during the night, and he had tried to get away for freedom, you know. So it was quite a thing in the news at the time.
Happening in 1948, when the communists took over our country by force, we become controlled by the communists. I already started disliking it. I planned to escape, and with other people's help, we managed to get a DC-3, overpowered a co-pilot. We had a flight engineer and a navigator as a crew members. So we overpowered them, put them in a baggage compartment, and MiG-15 supposedly, I haven't seen them, they've been on top of us, but they didn't want to go so close to the ground. So after 1 hour and 15 minutes, I knew we out of the country, because in Czechoslovakia we didn't have any neon lights. And the city which we flew over, I think it was Nuremberg. It was nothing but neon lights, because everybody tried to sell. And he said, immediately get the Czechoslovakian guys here to Frankfurt. I don't know if it was a publicity reason or whatever reason it was. So I welcomed it. I said, at least I come back to American side, because that's what we planned, to go to American side.
A couple floors down from us, they had what we called it a weather switch. All the weather in those days came in from outposts all around the Arctic, Russia. All of that information about weather was there was no problems. They interchanged that, and there was no problem because everybody was looking to get accurate weather maps. And so this weather department down there probably had, I bet it had 20 or 25 German men sitting down there with their headsets on and taking weather, which was in 5-digit numbers, as I remember, and they would type this, somehow it described the weather situation. They would dial in these outposts up in the Baffin Islands, I remember one of them, and other places where people would record the temperatures and all that stuff, and then it would somehow they would take that on in these radio transmissions, and the Germans would sit there and type this stuff out. And all this information then from all these different stations were taken down to another weather department, and they would calibrate that and they would put it on a map. And then the map was put on a drum, and they would scan it, and it would go to the United States. They would radio that thing, and that became the weather map for Europe. And this was a constant thing.
Were the Soviets cooperating with
Oh,
that?
yeah. All of this was, they didn't withhold anything. They each needed the weather.
Yeah.
And so there was no problem. As I understand it, there was never any problem that way. They needed it from our side as much as we needed it from them.
Here you are in Europe during this time period, yet the United States has the Korean War going on. Are you keeping track of what's going on there? What kind of intelligence are you getting?
Greg, that's something I have thought about at the time. When I have heard of what other GIs were doing at the same time in Korea and what they were going through, I don't think any of us had any idea what was going on. And I don't think we really knew or maybe even cared. We had our own thing to do. We were assigned to do where we were, what we were supposed to do, and that was our concern. And I don't really recall spending any time thinking or worrying about what the soldiers were doing over there in the snow and the cold. And I'm sure I didn't think of those things at that time.
Well, thank you, Ralph. This is great.
Fabulous.